I was born Catholic and baptized as an infant, and one of my first memories, and I was probably only 2 or 3 years old, of the Catholic Church was going with my grandmother and sitting next to her while she prayed the rosary and looked not at the cross but at the Virgin Mary, who in spite of the Catholic doctrine being otherwise is for many Catholic folks, I think particularly women, an embodiment of the divine feminine. And certainly she was for me, although I didn't talk about it in those terms for many years. I had that draw and still do. I still pray the rosary today. So that draw of the feminine was always there. I was in the Catholic Church and very active, even after the rest of my family had backed away and were no longer going to Mass. By the time I was 11, I was the only one going to church, and church was a refuge for me. And my experience of the Catholic Church as a child was very positive and very loving. And when others of my peers began to drop away as teenagers and young adults, I continued and was very active in my parish until I started teaching religious education to teenagers, and I could not teach the doctrine and have integrity, particularly the teachings about human sexuality. And so it was a decision akin to deciding I had to divorce. Very, very painful for me to leave a church I loved, and because I couldn't be in my own integrity and stay there. And that started a spiritual journey for me through the Eastern traditions. I practiced a yoga meditation practice for about 10, 12 years, and today that's still the kind of meditation that I practice. It was, most people when they hear yoga think about doing the physical yoga. It was not physical yoga. It was meditation and chanting in Sanskrit. And I also still do that as well. And what I loved about the yogic practice is that in the Hindu tradition, there is a balanced masculine and feminine. There's Shiva, the masculine, the Lord of the dance, and Shakti, who moves within us and has many associations that we might think of being attributed to the Holy Spirit. And so there I really began in a very conscious way to understand divinity as having many faces, both masculine and feminine and many other faces. That's where I began to form my own theology about the cosmos and grew into my understanding that God manifests as all of creation and is the ground of creation. I was in graduate school, so it must have been about 1992. A former colleague, I was an engineer, he was an engineer, had decided to become a Catholic priest. And he knew that I was practicing in the Hindu tradition, and one day he called me, and I was in graduate school at Berkeley, and he was up in Santa Rosa at a parish, and he said, "Come up and join us in a Hindu-Christian dialogue. There is a priest visiting who is very familiar with the Hindu practice, a Catholic priest, Anglican as it turned out. So come on up and we'll have a dialogue." And when I got to the rectory, the person who walked out of that back room was Father Bede Griffiths. He hadn't thought to mention that, which for me was like the Pope. He's written a great deal of commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. That was the book by my bedside. A deeply holy man. He was here, unfortunately, in the Bay Area for medical treatment, and he was toward the end of his life. But I spent an afternoon and an evening with him and my friend and another priest. And at the end of the evening, when I was preparing to leave, Father Bede gave me a blessing. And he said two things to me. One, very Hindu and very not Anglican. He said, "We are born into our tradition." And he said, "In the 40 years I've been in India, I have never converted a Hindu. I'm there for the Christians who are already there. And you will have to return. Find some kind of a path back." I could not imagine what that would be. And the other thing he said to me was he could see a vocation in me. He was the first to ever name that. I knew it when he said it. It had always been there. But because I had been in the Catholic tradition where there was no place for a vocation, particularly to parish ministry, you could go to the convent, which I considered at one point, but that wasn't my call. And then in the yogic tradition, I also considered becoming a swami, a monk, but that wasn't my call. And he named that for me for the first time, and I had to begin to lean in to the idea that I might actually be called to ministry in some form. What happened shortly after that is I read a book by Elaine Pagels called The Gnostic Gospels. And these are documents that were written by communities who had theologies that are different from the Orthodox theology that comes down to us in the Christian tradition. Of course, in those early centuries, there were many ways of understanding who Jesus was and why he had lived his life. And as the Orthodoxy formed toward about the 3rd century, many of these other understandings fell away and were finally considered heresy. And most of them had disappeared, but there was a cache found in Egypt of these documents at a town called Nag Hammadi. And we got for the first time to see what some of these early communities really thought about Jesus and about why he was here and about the risen Christ and what the qualities were of the risen Christ. And also, what is in those documents is a feminine face of divinity. The Sophia, the wisdom of God, is talked about in some sense almost equally with the Christ. So there is the Christ and the Sophia, and again there is that balance that comes, a balance that was lost when those documents, I think for other theological reasons, by the way, not because of this, fell away and were no longer circulated. And in that, I found a way back to Christianity. I found theology in those documents that resonated for me in a way some of the Orthodox teachings hadn't. And I found some that didn't. Gnostic covers a wide range of understandings. I finally had somebody ask me, well, what does it mean to be Gnostic? And the truth is, scholars don't use the word anymore, because really, if it was labeled Gnostic, what it means is one of the early church fathers didn't like it. And that was a wide range of beliefs. And I found myself then becoming a part of an independent Catholic community that really prayed with and worshiped with some of these documents, particularly the Gospel of Thomas, and ultimately chose to be trained for the priesthood in that independent Catholic tradition, and I was ordained as a priest in 2004. And I served as a priest in that community, and in another independent Catholic community, I served as their supply priest over those 6 years. And then I left that tradition for probably converging reasons. I think we don't make those decisions without a lot of things coming together. And for me, what I saw was an independent community whose polity was going off the rails because there was no other structure to hold it. And I came to have a deep appreciation for adjudicatory levels in the denominations that we didn't have there, nor in the other community. And I watched them starting to go off the rails at almost the same time. And I began to understand that what we were doing in such isolation that the wider Christian community wasn't even in dialogue with us about some of this material that I so loved, and that I probably needed to return to a more mainstream Christian tradition and be in dialogue about that. And so I stumbled into to College Heights. I had been co-leading a retreat. The Garrisons are here. Yes. I had been co-leading a retreat. I think that retreat was actually about Mary Magdalene. I'm not quite sure. With a friend of mine who was an Episcopal priest. And Jim and Marilyn were there, and they asked me if I would come and preach at College Heights Church. And I came and preached and never really left. I've been hanging around ever since. I found in the United Church of Christ a very wide theological tent. And one not just, oh yeah, we'll walk with you, no matter what weird thing you think, but actually being in dialogue and wanting to be in dialogue, and moving forward in all of our journeys because we're in dialogue. And I have to tell you, when I got here, I thought I had left ministry. There are some things that Charles said that I really related to. I thought I had left active ministry, and I was really happy to sit in the pews. And at the same time, what happened for me is I undertook the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola. And these are contemplations on the Gospels that you do with the spiritual director. It's usually done, you just take a month out of your life, but if you can't do that, they have a way to do it over a period of a year or two, meeting weekly. And every contemplation from the very beginning was some way or another of the Holy Spirit saying to me, I'm not done with you. That ministry is where you're headed. You're going to have to go back there. And I was enormously resistant. I didn't tell my spiritual director what I knew some of these contemplations meant actually for quite a number of months, because I didn't want to have an open dialogue about it. But she doesn't let go. And so the Holy Spirit had her way, as she usually does, and I acknowledged that I really needed to return to ministry and to do it in a mainstream tradition. And yes, that might mean that I wasn't just coasting toward retirement and I, was going to get to hang out and relax, that it would mean going back and getting more education, that it would mean spending time in community with other folks and coming to understand what that meant. This idea of covenant, actually, Scotty mentioned before, and you mentioned so beautifully, was an idea that was foreign to me. And understanding how covenant is held and how it works in community was key to my decision in those early years to move forward. And
Irene, I think the community is excited to be in dialogue with you. So if it's okay with you, yes. We'll move open to that, and people can ask their questions. Yeah.
Irene, so one thing I don't think you've had a chance to talk about is the call that you have to Peninsula
Exactly.
MCC.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that call and also the work that you've done with Peninsula MCC that has led to that call being issued.
So let me back up just one step from that. I have had two separate streams in my life for most of my adult life. One was my spiritual journey, and one was my professional life, and never should the two meet or cross over. And what has happened for me in my journey, and this goes right to my call, is that in the last couple of years I've come to understand that what I do professionally, those skills, can be of great service to the church. What I do professionally is all about being a change agent, about visioning and understanding where any group might go to achieve what they want to achieve. And then the hard part comes actually taking that vision and making it a reality. And to find that churches actually have that same need in the current landscape where, as we all know, church is changing quite dramatically, and we don't know what it's going to look like. I think not even in 10 years, no less further out than that. And so what has happened for me, first in an internship and then as an executive pastor in MCC San Francisco, where I just stumbled into a situation where some of my other life skills, just my business skills and my understanding of things like real estate and engineering, were brought to bear in order to move the congregation from where they were with the kind of resources they had and into a new kind of a place. I won't go into all the details, but I just kind of stumbled into that and came to understand that my life skills were important, and the Holy Spirit seemed to be pulling them together. And then Reverend Terry asked me to be her sabbatical replacement at Peninsula, so I came back to Peninsula and spent the summer doing all of the normal things a pastor does, and walking in discernment with a group of folks and then with the whole community about where Peninsula is and where they want to go, and developing what turned out to be a renewal plan after a lot of conversation. And part of why I now have a call as an associate pastor at Peninsula is to continue that renewal work and to take that next step of a vision that we all really co-created and want for the church, and take that and put it into a reality.
Irene, we know the medical crisis that you went through. It's good to see you with a nice head of hair. What in your religious life gave you strength during that process?
So I was diagnosed with breast cancer now 4.5 years ago. And so I walked around in a wig for about a year. I never felt that my life was threatened. So it was not traumatic in a way it might be. I just had a deep knowing that the cancer was treatable, and it appears, in fact, to have been treatable. And so I never experienced a lot of fear. I was uncomfortable a lot and cranky a lot. But I didn't really feel any fear. The discomfort I felt, to tell you the truth, was the discomfort of not being able to engage in some of the activities in my life that are precious to me. And at the top of that list is the animal rescue work that I do, that I still snuck out and did a certain amount of. But that was really, really hard for me, because that is close to who I authentically am.
You have one more, Chris.
I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but my ex-partner, can't, she's a survivor, but I was curious. I've heard over and over again from people that the cancer, was, if it hadn't been for the treatment, it would have been a great experience, because it's so transformative. And I don't know that you said anything, but if you couldn't reiterate, I'd be very interested in knowing that.
I skipped a little part there. I told you that I had a long struggle in the exercises. I was in those exercises when I was diagnosed. And the Holy Spirit had to literally get me flat on my back. I was too sick to read. I couldn't sleep. I did nothing but stare at the ceiling. And I finally admitted to myself that it was time to restructure my life, which meant starting a consulting practice that would give me a lot of flexibility, and get serious about the fact that I was called to ministry and that I couldn't delay it any longer.
All right, great. We'll have one more, Ralph, and then we'll conclude.
It's one of those questions where I actually have heard the answer before. But why are you seeking to be ordained in the UCC so you can work with the MCC?
So my journey actually started off with my assuming that I would be credentialed somehow in both the MCC and the UCC. And the UCC process for someone in midlife particularly is more attuned to taking into account life experience. And my wisdom circle that I really actually want to acknowledge, Carol Berriger and John Mabry and Bob McGrath, were wonderful, loving, supportive people in that process. And so I'm approaching ordination in the UCC. I have in fact fulfilled all of the requirements for ordination in the MCC except an MDiv. And I'll actually, because I am an eternal student, will probably actually get an MA in theology before a very long time. And we'll have something close to the specific kind of degree that they ask for.